Welcome, my friends. Tonight we drift way back to the hazy, golden-lit beginnings of the most powerful, and arguably most dysfunctional, marriage in the mythological sky executive suites, that of Hera and Zeus. You see them now, perhaps, standing on a freshly constructed Olympian balcony, the scent of newly mined ambrosia and ozone hanging in the air, the universe sprawling at their feet. He's the new king of the gods, brimming with a big deity energy that's both impressive and, as Hera is beginning to suspect, rather exhausting to live with. She, the regal queen, is likely already mentally rearranging the celestial furniture and wondering if eternal bliss was more of a contractual guideline than a guarantee. And let's be honest, given the honest eons of bickering ahead of them, you'll probably be fast asleep long before Hera ever gets a truly sympathetic ear from her thunder-happy husband. You probably won't survive this detailed account of their marital ennui without succumbing to slumber. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop a comment below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself wandering the nascent halls of their palace on Mount Olympus, the marble still cool in Mount Olympus, smelling faintly of creation dust and that new mountain smell. It's all very grand, of course, columns soar toward a sky that Zeus himself can command, and the ambient lighting is provided by actual starlight, which is a nice touch, if a little eye-touch inconsistent for reading. Hera, you observe, is trying to instill a sense of order, a touch of elegance. Her initial hopes for this marriage, this partnership, were as vast and luminous as the Milky Way itself. She'd envisioned a divine power couple ruling with wisdom, grace, and mutual respect. You can almost see her, in those early days, carefully selecting the perfect shade of cloud-woven tapestry for the royal bedchamber, a soft dove gray, perhaps to complement Zeus's stormy moods. She probably imagined quiet evenings, discussing the fate of mortals, or the proper way to season nectar. Not freeze. Zeus, you see, is already a little distracted. He's just overthrown Cronus and the Titans in a rather messy divine corporate takeover, and his mind is on consolidation of power, on drafting new Olympian bylaws, and on demonstrating exactly why he's the one with the lightning bolts, consolidating power. Yes, ensuring the ambrosia was decanted properly for their first official at-home with the other senior gods. Not so much. He had, wide-waddly things to do, like perfecting his smite or figuring out how to get that tricky echo effect just right when he thundered. You watch as Hera attempts to discuss the seating arrangements for the upcoming feast of the equinox. She has scrolls, diagrams even, meticulously detailing a plan that ensures Hestia isn't too close to the draft from the north wind, and that Poseidon has enough elbow room for his trident, which he tends to gesture with rather enthusiastically. "My dearest," she begins, her voice like the rustle of sacred olive leaves, "I was thinking, regarding the banquet." Zeus, you notice, is idly shaping a small, fluffy cloud into a passable likeness of a bull, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if this is the most pressing matter in the cosmos. He makes a sort of affirmative grunt. Zeus had mastered the art of the divine oh-ha, a sound that could mean anything from fascinating, my love, do go on, to that a new species of cloud sheep over there, forming above Crete. This, you realize, is the dawn of his selective hearing, a skill he would hone to an art form over the ensuing millennia. Hera's perfectly reasonable suggestions about, say, the slightly off-key drone of the junior wind gods during evening serenades or the alarming way young Hermes seemed to be borrowing shiny objects, would simply evaporate into the Olympian ether. And then there's the wandering eye. It's subtle at first, a lingering glance here, an overly effusive compliment there. You might see him praising the way a minor river nymph's hair catches the divine light, or how a mountain dryad has a particularly melodious laugh. Hera, whose very essence is tied to the sanctity of marriage and queenly dignity. These little visual detours, her smile tightens just a fraction. No dramatic confrontations yet, no throwing of celestial crockery, just a silent gathering awareness that her vision of shared sovereignty might require constant, wearying vigilance against external audits of her husband's attention. One of their earliest and most tellingly mundane disagreements revolves around the Olympian thrones themselves. Hera envisions a harmonious arrangement in the great throne room, a symbol of their united reign. She argues for balance, for a layout that speaks of partnership. You can almost hear her pointing out how, if they were placed side by side, angled slightly inward, it would foster communication. Zeus, however, has simpler criteria. His needs to be bigger, preferably with a footrest shaped like a vanquished titan, and positioned for optimal viewing of any dramatic weather phenomena or, more crucially, any interesting goings-on in the mortal. Hera, bless her immortal heart, was aiming for architectural digest, Olympian edition, while Zeus was clearly going for king of the hill. Literally, the debate, you imagine, was not loud or fiery, not yet. It was more a series of polite but firm restatements of position, with Zeus eventually just having his throne installed according to his own specifications, while Hera was off consulting with Themis about the legal definition of shared airspace. It's important to remember that in the context of ancient Greece, the oikos, the household, was considered the woman's domain. She was the manager of domestic affairs, responsible for the smooth running of the home, its resources, and its inhabitants. Hera, as queen of the gods, likely expected this principle to apply on a grand Olympian scale. She wasn't just a consort. She was, by right and by marriage, the chief operating officer of the divine household. Historians still argue whether Hera's famously jealous nature was an inherent trait or a direct, entirely predictable reaction to Zeus's relentless provocations and his undermining of her domestic and regal authority. The evidence, even in these early, quiet days, seems to be leaning towards the latter. You might also stumble upon some rather peculiar beliefs from the fringes of Greek thought that add another layer to their dynamic. Some obscure Orphic texts, for instance, whispered that Hera and Zeus's marriage was preordained by a cosmic yawn, a moment of universal boredom that necessitated a dramatic union to spice things up. This is a detail conveniently omitted from most prime-time Olympian dramas, and certainly not something Zeus would ever admit to, preferring the narrative of a grand, passionate pursuit. Hera, on the other hand, might have found a certain weary truth in the cosmic yawn theory as the centuries rolled by. For now, though, the disappointment is a small private ache, like a perfectly good chitin that's just a little too tight across the shoulders. The grand designs for Olympus are there, but the master architect and the king with the final say seem to be working from entirely different blueprints, one meticulously detailed, the other scribbled on the back of a thunderbolt requisition form. And Zeus, you note with a sigh that mirrors Hera's own, is already looking a bit restless, his gaze drifting towards the distant, sun-drenched lands below, as if wondering what new and exciting ventures might be found there, far from discussions about tapestry colors and throne alignments. The pattern, alas, is set. That restlessness you saw in Zeus, that distinct tendency to gaze beyond the meticulously planned Olympian gardens and towards Well, anywhere Hera wasn't currently discussing thread counts for the divine linens, naturally begins to manifest in other areas of their shared immortal existence. You now observe Hera turning her sharp, discerning gaze towards one of Zeus's most ancient and revered sources of authority, the Oracle of Dodona. It's not that she doubts the sanctity of the place itself, not initially. Dodona is old, very old, nestled in Epirus, where the voice of the divine whispers through the leaves of a sacred oak tree. You can almost hear the rustling now, a dry, sibilant sound like ancient secrets being shared, punctuated by the resonant clang of bronze cauldrons hanging from the branches, vibrating with messages from the ether. It's all suitably mystical. What Hera begins to question, with that impeccably logical mind of hers, are the interpretations of those whispers, especially when they are relayed or, shall we say, curated by Zeus himself. You see her there, perhaps on a visit to the sacred grove, her brow furrowed not in anger, but in deep, analytical thought. The air is cool and angry, smells of damp earth and old wood. The priests of Dodona, the Saloi, are a sight in themselves. It's a mainstream historical fact that these attendants of the oracle were known for their rather rustic habits, sleeping on the ground and famously not washing their feet, all in an effort to maintain their chthonic connection to the earth's wisdom. Hygiene. Hera, the proponent of hygiene and order, probably made a mental note to send them an anonymous gift basket filled with soap and pumice stones, care of a concerned Olympian housekeeper. But personal grooming habits of oracular staff aside, her primary concern is the content of the pronouncements. It starts subtly, negotiated compromise about, say, the allocation of divine resources for the upcoming Pan-Hellenic Games. Hera, you recall, is keen on proper budgeting. Then, a few days later, Zeus returns from a consultation with the Dodonian oak, looking grave and pious. "My dear," he might announce, his voice resonating with borrowed solemnity, "the leaves have spoken. There is a pressing need for an unscheduled expenditure on a new set of diamond-encrusted thunderbolts for enhanced divine deterrence. You understand." Hera, listening intently, might point out that the previous week the leaves had strongly advocated for fiscal prudence. The sacred oaks at Dodona, according to Zeus's convenient translations, often whispered things like, "Let Zeus have the last piece of ambrosia cake," or "Hera's proposed Olympian budget cuts are ill-advised by the rustling winds of fate." It was becoming a pattern. You can picture the scene. Hera, calm but resolute, tries to discuss these coincidences. "Zeus, light of my existence," she might begin, her tone impeccably reasonable. "It's just that the pronouncements from Dodona seem to align with your personal projects with astonishing frequency. Last month, when I suggested we catalog the contents of the celestial armory, the oak rustled about the importance of letting sleeping war dogs lie. This month, when you fancied that new summer cloud chariot, the leaves practically screamed about the need for a swift and comfortable divine conveyance. Zeus, in response, would likely adopt his most patient, slightly patronizing expression, the one that implied he was dealing with a beloved but ultimately unenlightened mortal. Mysteries of fate, the subtle language of the cosmos, and how one needed a special kingly ear to truly understand it. He might even suggest she's too caught up in the mundane to grasp the divine. Oh, the irony. Hera, you understand, is no fool. She's a goddess of immense power and intellect. She begins to suspect that the divine will emanating from Dodona had a remarkable knack for aligning perfectly with Zeus's current whims. If he wanted a new vintage of nectar from a far-flung corner of the cosmos, the leaves would suddenly rustle about the importance of expanding divine palettes for universal harmony. If had overpromised his support to some minor king, and offered a particularly plump sacrifice, Dodona would conveniently decree a divine intervention in Theban politics is now paramount. It was, to put it mildly, frustrating for a goddess who valued consistency, and dare we say, honesty in her partnerships. Adding to her skepticism is the nature of the communication itself. Jurors continue to debate the precise methods of divination at Dodona, whether it was purely the rustling leaves, the drawing of lots from a sacred pitcher, the observation of the flight of doves, interpretation of the sound of water from the sacred spring, or a complex combination of all these. This inherent ambiguity, you realize, provides considerable leeway for the interpreter-in-chief, namely Zeus. He could pick and choose his preferred medium, or perhaps blend the messages into a divine smoothie of convenient truths. A quirky little tidbit from some ancient commentaries suggests that the famous talking doves of Dodo, said to deliver prophecies in human voices, might not have been literal birds, but a metaphorical reference to the priestesses there. Perhaps due to the soft cooing quality of their chants, or even a linguistic misunderstanding, as the word Pelei could refer to both doves and elderly women. If human priestesses were involved, Hera might have fought, then the chances of purely Rhesius filtered messages increased significantly. She could just imagine him having a quiet word with a favored priestess. Just ensure the oak emphasizes the unquestionable leadership part this week. There's a good lass. So, you see Hera, not storming or raging, but observing, collecting data, much like a divine auditor suspecting celestial embezzlement of truth. Her early hopes for a partnership, for that shared throne you saw her mentally arranging in Section 1, are now being subtly eroded by these one-sided divine decrees. She's beginning to understand that Zeus's idea of communication is less a dialogue and more a series of ideologue pronouncements, preferably from an ancient, leafy source that can't argue back or demand clarification on budgetary line items. The rustling of those sacred oak leaves, once perhaps a sound of comfort and divine connection for her, now likely carries a faint, almost imperceptible undertone of her husband's latest self-serving agenda. And the problem, as you can already foresee, is that calling out the king of the gods on manipulating his own sacred oracle is a domestic dispute with very few appealing outcomes for the queen. She files it away, another entry in the growing catalogue of things Zeus mostly ignores, or worse, actively engineers to his own benefit, all while maintaining an air of unimpeachable divine authority. Wind sighs through the Olympian colonnades, carrying the faint, metallic tang of an approaching thunderstorm, and perhaps a very, very quiet sigh from Hera herself. The subtle sighs and the mental cataloging of Zeus's Dodona-inspired evasions you witnessed are beginning to coalesce into a more direct, if still regally restrained, line of questioning from Hera. You can almost feel the atmosphere on Olympus growing a tad more charged than usual, not with the exciting crackle of an impending thunderstorm, but with the more uncomfortable tension of an overdue domestic discussion. Perhaps Hera has finally cornered Zeus with incontrovertible proof that the Olympian nectar reserves are depleting at a rate directly proportional to the number of visiting artists Zeus has been mentoring in his private study. Or maybe she's reopened the discussion about the persistently leaky roof over the West Wing's aviary, where her prized peacocks are now developing a distinct dislike for unseasonable indoor rain. She might have even, bless her optimistic heart, been attempting to get a firm commitment on that new zoning proposal for Ambrosia Gardens. ensuring a sustainable harvest for centuries to come. You see her, scrolls of neatly penned notes in hand, patiently waiting for Zeus to finish admiring his reflection in a newly polished shield. She was just getting to the part about the Nemean lion Zeus had promised to take care of 3 centuries ago, which was now apparently using her favorite sunbathing rock as a scratching post, when suddenly, oh look, a shiny golden apple. The timing, you reflect, is impeccable, almost divinely inspired, in its capacity for derailing an uncomfortable conversation. The wedding of Peleus, a thoroughly decent mortal hero and Thetis, a shimmering sea nymph, is in full swing. Well-known mythological fact that this was a huge social event, attended by nearly all the gods and goddesses. Thetis herself was so desirable that both Zeus and Poseidon had once pursued her, until a rather inconvenient prophecy revealed her future son would surpass his father in greatness, a career-limiting prospect for any ruling deity. So, Zeus is probably already a little relieved he dodged that particular marital bullet. The celebrations are lavish, the nectar flows freely, perhaps a little too freely, Hera might note, eyeing the dwindling supplies. And then Eris, the goddess of discord, makes her entrance, uninvited, naturally. Who invites discord to a wedding? It's like inviting your most critical relative to a housewarming. You just know they'll find fault with the plumbing. Eris, true to form, doesn't bring a casserole. She rolls a gleaming golden apple across the floor, inscribed with the deceptively simple words, "For the fairest, now in the grand scheme of Olympian concerns, cosmic balance, the proper smiting of hubristic mortals, keeping Tartarus securely locked, a single piece of enchanted fruit causing a tiff amongst 3 goddesses, should barely register, a minor celestial squabble. At best, you watch as Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, all rather high-profile deities, with impressive resume, immediately lay claim to the apple. The ensuing celestial squabble over who was fairest made modern reality TV show arguments look like polite tea parties. There was probably some divine hair-pulling, or at least some very pointed glaring across the nectar bar. Hera, of course, has a strong claim. Queen of the gods, regal, majestic, Athenia, goddess of wisdom and warfare, embodies a different, formidable kind of beauty. Aphrodite, well, beauty is literally her job description. Here is where you see Zeus's genius for strategic avoidance shine brighter than any polished shield. He could have intervened. He could have made a kingly pronouncement, perhaps declared it a 3-way tie, and commissioned Hephaestus to craft 2 more identical apples. He could have suggested a complex scoring system based on inner beauty, divine power, and contributions to Olympian society. A system Hera would undoubtedly have aced, but no, that would be too simple, too direct, and more importantly, it wouldn't provide nearly enough distraction from Hera's pressing questions about, say, the structural integrity of the aforementioned aviary. Instead, Zeus picks up the golden apple, weighs it in his hand with a thoughtful expression that you now recognize as his "I am about to deflect responsibility" look, declares the matter too delicate, too fraught with peril for him, the king of gods and husband-father to 2 of the claimants, to judge impartially. Oh, the burdens of leadership! Zeus, with the sagacity of a king who really didn't want to choose between his wife, his daughter, and the goddess of love in a beauty contest, declared the matter required a fresh mortal perspective. Convenient that he magnifies the incident from a spat into a pivotal decision, one that requires the incident from a spat into a pivotal decision. An outside arbiter, a hapless Trojan shepherd named Paris. You can almost see the cogs turning in Zeus's mind. This little apple, this tiny seed of discord, could blossom into a magnificent, all-consuming drama. It would involve a journey, a judgment, bribes disguised as divine incentives, of course, and almost certainly significant long-term repercussions. Perfect. Hera, now one of the principal contestants in this divinely ordained beauty pageant, is momentarily diverted. Her meticulous notes on Olympian infrastructure and resource management are set aside. The leaky aviary roof is, for now, forgotten. Her focus shifts to preparing her presentation for Paris, ensuring her queenly radiance is at its peak, perhaps subtly reminding him of the benefits of having the Queen of Heaven on his side. Mid-Taraffers still debate whether Zeus's decision to pass the judgment of the golden apple to Paris was a genuine attempt at impartiality, a shrewd political maneuver to sow discord among potential rivals, or even among these powerful goddesses, or simply an inspired act of deflecting his wife's attention from his own recent shortcomings in the domestic sphere. Given his track record with those Dodona decrees you saw earlier, you might find yourself leaning towards the latter explanation. It's a masterclass in marital misdirection. The original, mundane issue Hera was raising, whatever it was, is now lost in the golden gleam of the apple, and the brewing storm of divine vanity is swept neatly under the celestial rug. And speaking of uninvited guests and divine pettiness, a rather quirky tidbit from some lesser-known satirical text suggests Eris wasn't always the most dreaded party crasher. The personification of blame or criticism, Momus, was also frequently left off invitation lists, because he had an infuriating habit of finding fault with everything, from the way Apollo tuned his lyre to the quality of ambrosia he served, making Eris apple-tossing seem almost like a charming party trick by comparison. Zeus probably made a mental note to invite Momus to the next budget meeting with Hera. It might make his own evasiveness seem positively constructive. For now, though, the stage is set for a much grander drama, one that will have consequences far beyond a damp peacock feather or an unbalanced nectar budget. Zeus has successfully turned a minor spat into a major event, ensuring that everyone, especially Hera, has something far more glamorous and distracting to worry about than his own kingly responsibilities on the home front. You watch him lean back on his throne, a picture of serene impartiality, as the three goddesses begin to strategize. The faint scent of ozone from his earlier shield polishing mixes with the distant, salty air from the Aegean, where Peleus and Thetis are probably wondering why their wedding reception suddenly got so intense. Another domestic crisis, averted Zeus style. The man really should have written a handbook. The dust, both literal and metaphorical, from the Trojan War, that rather messy affair sparked by Zeus's clever golden apple diversion you saw him orchestrate, took a long time to settle. Centuries, in fact. You'd think after such a prolonged period of external drama, of heroes rising and falling, of divine interventions and epic poems being furiously scribbled down by inspired mortals, that perhaps a bit of domestic peace might be on the Olympian agenda. Hera certainly hoped so. With the echoes of battle finally fading to a dull roar in the mortal realm, she turns her attention back to more immediate and perennially overlooked concerns, the general state of decorum and aesthetics in the celestial palace. After the whole messy golden apple business finally simmered down to a low, brutal, multi-decade war, Hera had hoped for return to some semblance of domestic tranquility, perhaps starting with curtains that didn't look like they'd been used as victory banners by the Cyclope after a particularly rowdy forge party. You observe her, a paragon of queenly grace, attempting to bring a touch of refined elegance to the somewhat haphazard grandeur of Olympus. It's not that the palace isn't impressive, is in a colossal, slightly overwhelming way, but Zeus's decorating tastes, if they could be called that, lean heavily towards the functional/trophy display end of the spectrum. Think giant thunderbolt racks, shields from past skirmishes hung slightly askew, and the odd stuffed monster head that he insists has character. Hera's Pinterest board for Olympus, if such a divine tool existed, would be all serene grandeur and harmonious flow. Zeus's, if he had one, would likely be a title, big thrones, bigger lightning, and places I've conquered or wooed. So, Hera embarks on a noble quest to refresh the Olympian interiors. You see her consulting with the Graces on color palettes, perhaps sketching designs for new mosaics that don't exclusively feature Zeus smiting. Something, her primary focus, for a while, becomes the drapes in the grand feasting hall. The current ones are, to put it mildly, ancient, woven from something heavy and vaguely metallic. They absorb light rather than reflect it, giving the hall the cheerful ambience of a high-class cave. Hera has sourced some exquisite new fabrics, one woven from captured moonlight, giving off a soft silvery sheen, and another from the condensed hues of twilight, a gentle blend of lavender and rose. Feels both majestic and welcoming, a place where gods can dine without feeling they're perpetually attending a war council. When Hera presented him with two exquisite samples of cloud silk for the new curtains, one embroidered with constellations, and the other with subtle dawn hues, Zeus squinted at them as if they were complex battle plans from an unfamiliar enemy, then asked if either could double as a toga in a pinch. His indifference is, you note, thunderous in its own quiet way. He doesn't argue, he doesn't overtly forbid the changes. He simply doesn't engage. "The lilac, my dear, or the one that shimmers?" Hera asks, holding them up. Zeus, who is idly watching the chariot race form in the patterns of drifting clouds below, merely grunts, "Mim? Oh, either is fine, my love, as long as they don't get in the way of the, airflow. Airflow. That's his primary concern for drapery that will adorn the central gathering place of the gods. You can almost see Hera's perfectly sculpted shoulders sag. Just a fraction. It's not the cost, of course. Olympus has an unlimited budget for divine home improvements. It's the sheer, monumental disinterest. This isn't an isolated incident. She suggests replacing a particularly grim tapestry depicting the castration of Uranus, a family event Zeus prefers to commemorate with stark realism, with something a little more cheerful, perhaps a pastoral scene of nymphs picking flowers. Zeus claims the old tapestry is historically significant and a talking point. Hera privately thinks the only thing it talks about is the Olympian family's deep-seated need for therapy. She proposes new, more comfortable seating arrangements in the lesser audience chamber, designed to encourage actual conversation rather than just pronouncements from on high. Zeus worries it will make the supplicants too comfortable and less inclined to offer impressive sacrifices. It's a historical fact that ancient Greek homes, even those of mortals, especially among the wealthy, often featured beautifully painted walls, intricate mosaics, and elaborate textiles. The desire to create an aesthetically pleasing and status-affirming living environment was quite common. Aspirations for Olympus are hardly out of sync with the cultural value placed on a well-adorned home, just on a much grander scale. Her attempts to refresh the Olympian aesthetics are consistently met with this wall of kingly apathy. Archaeologists and classicists continue to debate the extent to which specific decorative motifs in divine iconography and temple adornment were purely aesthetic choices or carried deeper symbolic meanings, much like Hera's own attempts to imbue Olympus with a sense of ordered majesty beyond Zeus's more bombastic, conquest-focused taste. She's not just picking out swatches. She's trying to craft an environment that reflects divine harmony, not just divine might. Zeus, however, seems to view any chair as adequate as long as it doesn't collapse, and any wall as sufficiently decorated if it isn't actively crumbling. You might recall those convenient Dodona decrees from earlier. It wouldn't surprise you if, during one of Hera's more enthusiastic redecorating phases, the sacred oak leaves had once rustled something about true beauty being found in the untamed majesty of the storm-swept sky, not in woven draperies or the fussy placement of celestial settees, a pronouncement Zeus would then quote with smug satisfaction whenever Hera brought out a new color chart for the Hall of Whispering Winds. There's even an obscure, fringe belief whispered in some forgotten household almanacs that certain colors or patterns woven into household fabrics could subtly influence the inhabitants, perhaps warding off minor, troublesome sprites or even encouraging specific dreams. One could almost imagine Hera, in a moment of desperate optimism, selecting a particular shade of devotion blue or monogamy mauve for the curtains in their private chambers, hoping it might subconsciously steer Zeus's thoughts towards fidelity. He, of course, probably just complained that the new color made it harder to see the lightning bugs he'd let loose for amusement. Ultimately, many of Hera's proposed decor changes were met with such a profound lack of opinion from Zeus that she suspected he wouldn't notice if she replaced his throne with an oversized, cloud-stuffed bean chair, as long as it had a good view of the mortal realm's more scandalous activities and a conveniently placed nectar holder. The curtains, you wonder, they probably remained the same for another an or two, or perhaps Hera, in a moment of quiet rebellion, changed them herself, and Zeus, true to form, simply didn't notice, or if he did, merely grunted something about the airflow being slightly different. Another grand vision for Olympian harmony gently fades, another instance of queenly initiative meeting kingly indifference, off far away in Hera's ever-expanding mental archive of unacknowledged efforts. You can almost hear the faint, ghostly rustle of unchosen fabric samples sighing in a forgotten celestial storeroom. Zeus' profound disinterest in whether the Olympian feasting hall was draped in tasteful twilight hues or ancient, dusty monster hides, as you've seen, doesn't mean he's entirely detached from the material comforts of their divine abode. His attention can be remarkably sharp when it comes to certain consumable assets, and so, with the great curtain debate having ended not with a bang, but with a kingly shrug, you now observe Hera's focus shifting from the aesthetic to the alimentary, specifically to the contents of the Olympian pantry and wine cellar, or rather, the nectar and ambrosia stores. The king of the gods might not care about airflow through new drapes, but the flow of high-quality nectar down his royal gull. That, you surmise, is another matter entirely. Hera, in her capacity as queen and chief, though often unacknowledged, manager of the Olympian household, naturally keeps a meticulous mental inventory. Nectar and ambrosia, as you know, were the very food and drink of the Greek gods, the source of their immortality and divine vigor. Thus, careful stewardship of these precious, life-sustaining resources would have been a critical aspect of running the divine household well. Amphorae contain the everyday drinking nectar, perfectly acceptable for quenching a god's thirst after a long morning of, say, orchestrating a minor earthquake or inspiring a particularly convoluted epic poem. And she knows which ones hold special vintages, the nectar aged in forgotten moonbeams, the ambrosia made from the laughter of firstborn stars, the good stuff she reserves for important state banquets, or for a quiet evening when she wants to forget, just for a moment, that she's married to a human-shaped thunderstorm with commitment issues. Lately, however, you notice a troubled frown creasing her usually serene brow, as she inspects the cool, dim storerooms. The level of the Elysian gold vintage, a nectar so exquisite it was said to taste like realized dreams, is suspiciously low. The amphora of starfire dew, distilled from the tails of comets, and usually only cracked open on their anniversary. An event Zeus has a talent for overlooking, as you might later witness, is nearly half empty, despite said anniversary being months away, or perhaps conveniently just past and uncelebrated. Hera began to develop a sixth sense, a kind of divine nectar dar, that tingled whenever Zeus or one of his suspiciously radiant protégés, those visiting artists or diplomatic attachés you saw him mentoring before, walked by reeking faintly of her private stock. Her primary suspect, naturally, is Zeus. He has the access, the divine gall, and a well-documented history of indulgence. Perhaps he's been hosting a few too many late-night strategy sessions with his latest nymph of the month, liberally sharing the celestial equivalent of top-shelf champagne. Or maybe his pet eagle has developed a taste for the finer things, and Zeus, ever the indulgent master, can't say no to those big, pleading eagle eyes. You can almost picture Hera, her footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor, running a perfectly manicured finger over a suspiciously sticky ring on a shelf where a prized bottle of ambrosia liqueur once stood. There are no little notes saying, "IU 1 bottle of cosmic delight, signed Zeus." Just a lingering scent of ozone mixed with the faint, spectral aroma of her favorite after-dinner tipple. Her investigation is subtle, born of long experience. She doesn't make loud accusations. That rarely ends well when dealing with the king of lightning bolts. Instead, you might see her casually questioning, "Ganymede, the comely young cupbearer? Tell me, Ganymede, dear boy," she'd ask, her voice smooth as aged nectar itself, "has there been an unusual run on the Olympian sunset blend? I only ask because the stores seem to be depleting rather enthusiastically." Ganymede, caught between loyalty to his king and fear of his queen, would likely stammer something about increased hospitality requirement, or unexpectedly thirst out delegations from Thrace. Hera would nod, her gaze thoughtful, adding another piece of circumstantial evidence to her mental dossier. When Hera inquired about a rapidly diminishing cask of Centaur Strength Celebration mead, a brew so potent it was said to make even Hephaestus dance, Zeus would vaguely mumble about evaporation being particularly severe this aeon, or the necessity of making essential libations to the spirit of, well, spirits and spontaneous revelry, all while trying to discreetly hide a telltale purple stain on the cuff of his otherwise immaculate white chiton. It's the Olympian equivalent of finding cookie crumbs on the face of someone who swears they haven't been near the biscuit tin. Classicists still ponder whether the concept of a divine pantry with varying qualities of nectar and ambrosia was a literal belief in celestial nami, or perhaps a sophisticated metaphor for the hierarchical distribution of divine favor, status, and power within the Olympian court, with Hera naturally guarding her own access to the top-shelf privileges. Either way, someone is definitely dipping into the premium reserves without prior authorization, and Hera is not just about the thirst nectar itself. It's the principle, the lack of consideration, the undermining of her management of their shared divine resources. It's one thing for Zeus to ignore her taste in curtains. It's another for him to pilfer the very essence of the gods from under her nose, more quirky, and perhaps slightly mischievous tidbit from some ancient commentators and scholiasts on divine matters theorized that different nectars and ambrosias possessed unique secondary properties beyond just bestowing immortality. One vintage might enhance prophetic visions, another might bolster courage, while a third could, allegedly, increase one's persuasive charm, or even induce amorous feelings. You can imagine her subscribe to this thinking. You can imagine her suspicions taking on a sharper edge. Is Zeus raiding the irresistible eloquence elixir before a clandestine meeting? Is that why the wheat forgetfulness cordial, which she uses to soothe particularly ruffled diplomatic feathers, is always running low after one of his more complicated dalliances comes to light? It adds another layer to her quiet, simmering resentment. Hera briefly considered installing a miniature Hephaestus designed booby trap on the pantry door, something involving a small targeted lightning zap for unauthorized hands, or perhaps a mildly embarrassing illusion that made the culprit think they were suddenly wearing a chiton made of live eels. But she decided against it. The paperwork for accidental smiting of a major or minor deity due to snack-related infractions was apparently horrendous, and knowing her luck, she'd probably end up zapping a guilt-ridden Hebe who was only sneaking an extra thimbleful for courage before facing a feasting hall full of demanding gods. So, the great nectar-nicking caper continues a silent, ongoing skirmish in the Cold War of Olympian domesticity. Hera tightens her metaphorical pantry security, perhaps by developing a new, even more complex celestial locking mechanism based on lunar phases and prime numbers. Zeus, in turn, likely views it as an amusing challenge, another small way to assert his kingly prerogative, to take whatever he fancies. You see Hera making a fresh entry in her mental ledger, right next to curtain indifference and Dodona decree manipulation. The finest vintages of Olympus continue to vanish, and the queen's patience, much like her private stock of starfire dew, dwindles just a little bit more with each unexplained disappearance. Dead of the Olympian night becomes another sound adding to the subtle soundtrack of her ignored grievances, that depleted amphora of starfire dew, the one you saw Hera sadly contemplating in the Olympian storerooms, the nectar usually reserved for celebrating her and Zeus's anniversary, serves as a rather potent, if silent, prelude to another recurring theme in their divine domestic tapestry: Zeus's remarkable talent for anniversary amnesia. It's one thing to suspect your husband of pilfering the good celestial liquor for his own amusements, or to entertain his entourage of special projects. It's quite another for him to completely forget the very occasion that bottle was meant to honor. Again, the again is important here. A small word carrying eons of accumulated sighs and unspoken frustrations. You can imagine Hera in the led up to the fateful day. There's a subtle shift in her queenly routine. Perhaps she instructs the Graces to weave a particularly luminous new peplos for her, in a shade that complements the very first sunrise they watched together from the peak of Mount Ida all those millennia ago. Might be she's discreetly commissioned Hephaestus, who, despite his own parental grievances with her, is a consummate craftsman, to create a small elegant token, something symbolic of their enduring, if frequently strained, bond, nothing too ostentatious. She learned long ago that competing with Zeus's grand gestures was a fool's errand. Her hopes are simpler, more aligned with the quiet dignity of her station, an acknowledgement, perhaps a shared glass of that very starfire dew, if any were left, a moment where he looks at her not just as the queen of Olympus, or the manager of his chaotic divine household, but as Hera, his wife, the one with whom he forged the cosmos of Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage between a sky god like Zeus and a powerful goddess, was a profoundly significant religious idea throughout the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, symbolizing cosmic harmony, fertility, and the ordering of the universe. Their union wasn't just a divine wedding. It was a foundational event. You'd think the anniversary of such a universe-aligning event would be hard to miss, yet for Zeus, it often seems to possess the memorability of a minor footnote. In the minutes of last Aeon's council meeting, Zeus's ability to recall the precise lineage of every minor river nymph in Arcadia, or the wind speed variations around Mount Cithaeron during the last vernal equinox, was legendary. His ability to recall the date he actually married the queen of the gods. Less so, he probably had a reminder chiseled on a stone tablet somewhere by Hermes, then promptly used the stone to smite a particularly annoying titan or prop up a wobbly table leg in his private study. The day dawns, perhaps with the sky off, exceptional clarity, a detail Hera might wistfully interpret as a good omen. She waits and waits. Zeus, you observe, is his usual bustling self. He's deeply engrossed in designing a new, more aerodynamically efficient thunderbolt, or has, mediating a hilariously petty squabble between Apollo and Eris over who gets to claim a particularly valiant, and now deceased, mortal hero for their respective fan clubs, or, even more gallingly, he's noticeably absent, having remembered a critically important, time-sensitive mission to inspect a newly formed archipelago in the Aegean, an archipelago that just happens to be teeming with remarkably attractive sea nymphs. An anniversary with Hera, but there was this fascinating new cloud formation over Crete that looked suspiciously like a swan, and he simply ran to investigate, purely for meteorological reasons. Of course, Hera might try dropping hints, as you'd expect, at first, delivered with queenly grace. Doesn't the air smell particularly vow-like today, my king? She might inquire, her voice like the gentle chiming of distant temple bells. Zeus, deeply engrossed in polishing his aegis, might just grunt affirmatively, assuming she's referring to the ozone from his recent weather experiments. As the day wears on and the Olympian sun begins its descent, her hints might become a little less subtle. You can almost see her leaving a beautifully illuminated calendar scroll open on his throne, the significant date circled with a rare, vibrant pigment, perhaps with a small hopeful note. "Remember this, my love." He'd probably glance at it, assume it was a reminder for some tedious administrative task, and make a mental note to delegate it to Hermes. She likely considered leaving a calendar open on his throne, circled with "Our Eternal Commitment Day. Don't forget, you oaf," in bold charcoal. But even her patience had its aesthetic limits. Her reaction is not, at this stage, the famed Hera rush that shakes mountains and curses bloodlines. Not yet. What you witness is a more insidious, quieter corrosion of spirit. A deep, simmering ire, the slow burn of repeated disappointment. Her regal composure remains largely intact, but you might notice the slight tightening of her lips, an almost imperceptible coolness that enters her voice when she next addresses him about some mundane Olympian matter, like the need to replenish the nectar stores he so carelessly depletes. It's the quiet chill that precedes a much larger storm. Her initial hopes for their marriage, those grand visions of partnership you glimpsed in the early days, flicker like a lamp in a draught. We scholars of mythology continue to discuss whether the repeated emphasis on Zeus's infidelities and general neglect within the myth served primarily as a theological exploration of the inherent tension between cosmic order, which Hera often represents, and the untamable, procreative, and often chaotic force of Zeus's desires, or if it also subtly reflected societal anxieties about marital stability, the duties of husbands, and the responsibilities that came with great power, particularly for male figures in ancient Greek society. whatever the deep mythological or societal underpinnings. For Hera, in these moments, is simply personal. The sting of being forgotten, of her significance in his life being overshadowed by literally anything else the cosmos has to offer. Refair was an ancient, albeit somewhat obscure, Greek folk practice, a charming little ritual where, to ensure a happy and enduring marriage, mortal couples would sometimes offer small identical honey cakes or paired doves to statues of Hera and Zeus on their own wedding anniversaries. The hope was that the divine couple, reminded of their own sacred vows, would bestow blessings upon the human union. You can almost picture Hera observing such a humble offering from her Olympian vantage point, a wistful smile playing on her lips as she wishes, just for a moment, that her own divine husband might consider such a simple act of remembrance. Perhaps she'd even settle for him, just noticing the special meal she'd had the kitchens prepare, now growing cold on the celestial sideboard. The silence in their private chambers that evening is likely vast and echoing, filled only with the distant, indifferent twinkle of the stars and the quiet, almost inaudible crackle of Hera's slowly accumulating resentment. Another anniversary passes, unremarked by the king, but deeply felt by the queen. The sting of a forgotten anniversary, as you witnessed, tends to linger in the rarefied Olympian air long after the day itself has passed into the oblivion of Zeus's memory. That simmering ire, that quiet build-up of unacknowledged slights, often seeks an outlet, and sometimes the most majestic queen, feeling particularly ignored on a personal level, might find her gaze fixing on a more tangible, if still Zeus adjacent, source of daily irritation, the king's personal mascot, his enormous, overindulged golden eagle, Atos Dios. If Zeus couldn't be bothered to remember their sacred vows, he was certainly not going to get a free pass on the egregious etiquette of his feathered favorite. You see, this isn't just any eagle, this is King Eagle, a magnificent creature with a wingspan that could cast a shadow over a small village, feathers that gleam like freshly minted drachmas, and eyes that hold the ancient wisdom of the skies. Or so Zeus claims. Primary and powerful symbol of Zeus, his faithful attendant and often depicted as the bearer of his devastating thunderbolts. In some particularly grim tales, it was this very eagle, or just like it, dispatched by Zeus to daily torment the fat Titan Prometheus, making it an undeniable instrument of the king's will. Eruption, walking, flying, screeching emblem of Zeus's authority. And from Hera's perspective, it's also a monumental pest with appalling house manners. The problem isn't that the eagle occasionally brings Zeus important messages or looks impressive perched on his arm during divine pronouncements. The problem is the day-to-day mess. You observe Hera, her lips pursed, as she spots yet another colossal eagle feather, the size of a short sword, drifting lazily down to land, directly in a bowl of freshly prepared ambrosia, intended for the lesser gods' luncheon. The shedding season, you imagine, is a particular nightmare for the Olympian cleaning staff. Probably some overworked cloud nines. Then there are the drop-ins. Hera suspected the eagle was actively aiming for her favorite white marble benches in the east colonnade, the ones that caught the morning sun so perfectly. It had developed a kind of grano-based abstract expressionism that, while perhaps artistically bold for a bird, was hell on the divine upholstery and required immediate, specialized cleaning. And the noise. The creature has a screech that could curdle nectar at 50 paces, often unleashed at the most inopportune moments, during a delicate negotiation with a delegation of easily startled river gods, for instance, or just as Hera is trying to enjoy a rare moment of quiet contemplation in her private gardens. Hera list of grievances against the eagle was longer than the Minotaur's grocery bill, and included excessive and untimely screeching during lyre recitals by Apollo himself, unauthorized napping on the sacred altar of Hestia, using the reflecting pool in the hall of contemplation as a birdbath, and leaving suspicious-looking pellets on the council chamber floor that suspiciously resembled half-digested thunderball fragments posing a clear safety hazard. So, Hera, with the weary patience of someone who has tried every other tactic, decides to lodge a formal complaint. You can picture her approaching Zeus, not in a fury, but with a meticulously prepared scroll detailing the eagle's latest infractions, complete with date, times, and supporting testimony from aggrieved dryads, whose sacred trees had been used for impromptu talon sharpening. "Zeus, my sovereign," she might begin, her voice dangerously calm, "regarding Eidos Dios, we really need to have a serious discussion about designated roosting areas, acceptable decibel levels, and perhaps some basic talon etiquette training. The current laissez-faire approach to its reactivity is becoming untenable for the general upkeep and serenity of Olympus." Zeus's reaction, as you might predict, is one of profound refusal to discipline his cherished companion. Had listened with that infuriatingly patient expression he reserves for what he considers Hera's domestic fussing. He might chuckle, ruffle the eagle's head feathers, if it happened to be perched conveniently nearby, probably on some priceless antique vase Hera was fond of, and declare, "But my dear, he is a creature of the wild sky, a symbol of untamed power. His spirit mustn't be caged by petty household rules." When Hera pointed out that the eagle had recently used a priceless, newly acquired tapestry, one depicting her own rather dignified coronation, no less, as a makeshift napkin after a messy celestial rodent snack, Zeus merely patted the bird's head and said, "He has expensive taste, my dear, recognizes Hera was, as you can imagine, not amused by the implication that her coronation tapestry was akin to a discarded pigeon bone. One unusual variant myth, perhaps one Zeus himself, subtly encouraged, suggests that he was nursed by an eagle as an infant when hidden away from Cronus on Mount Ida, or even that the eagle was once a pious mortal king named Periphas, transformed into the bird by Zeus as a reward and mark of honor. If there's any truth to these tales, it would certainly explain Zeus's almost paternal indulgence and his staunch refusal to see any fault in the creature's behavior. It's not just a symbol, it's practically family, or at least an old, feathered comrade in arms. Disciplining it would be like disciplining a part of his own mythic backstory. Art historians and mythologists often debate the precise symbolic transition of the eagle from a more generic totemic animal revered in earlier Aegean Bronze Age cultures to Zeus's specific, highly personalized divine messenger and unambiguous emblem of supreme Olympian power, and whether its perceived untamable wildness was considered integral to this potent symbolism or just a convenient excuse for its bad behavior. Hera, you suspect, leans heavily towards the convenient excuse theory. She's all for potent symbolism, as long as it doesn't shed on the good furniture or treat her private sanctuary like an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. The eagle situation thus becomes another festering point of contention, a daily reminder of Zeus's priorities. Hell move mountains, literally, to defend his bird's right to redecorate the palace with its droppings, but can't seem to remember an anniversary or the importance of consulting his queen on matters that directly affect their shared domain. You see Hera, defeated for now on this front. Making another mental note, the eagle continues its reign of minor terror, a feathered, flying embodiment of Zeus's selective attention and Hera's ongoing, very mundane, struggle for a bit of order and respect in her own divine home. The faint, musky scent of eagle, now a permanent part of Olympus's olfactory signature, probably makes her sigh just a little deeper each time she catches a whiff. The lingering, musky scent of Zeus's overindulged eagle, Aetos, Dios, and the constant, minor irritations it represented, the feathers, the droppings, the general disregard for Olympian decorum you saw Hera battling, naturally contribute to the queen's ever-simmering reservoir of divine dissatisfaction. When direct complaints about one of Zeus's beloved symbols of power fall on deaf or deliberately obtuse, royal, with the strategic acumen honed over eons of marital diplomacy, might subtly shift her focus. If she can't get Zeus to manage his bird, perhaps she can find fault with his Gruak new favorite, the remarkably comely youth now gracing the Olympian halls as the king's personal cupbearer, Ganymede. You see him now, Ganymede, the Trojan prince, whose beauty was so extraordinary it apparently warranted a divine abduction. Writes a mainstream mythological fact that Ganymede was snatched away from his earthly pursuits by Zeus, often appearing in the guise of that very same problematic eagle, a detail that surely didn't escape Hera's notice, and installed as the cupbearer to the gods. Disappointment was particularly galling for Hera, as it either displaced or, at best, forced her own daughter, Hebe, the goddess of youth and the traditional cupbearer, to share her duties. So, when Ganymede nervously navigates the feasting hall with his pitcher of nectar, you can be sure Hera's gaze is upon him, sharp and analytical. Her critiques are, on the surface, almost laughably petty. You might observe her watching Ganymede pour ambrosia for, say, Ares. The golden liquid shimmers. The god of war grunts his thanks, but Hera's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arches almost imperceptibly. Might casually remark to Zeus, that new cupbearer, Ganymede, he pours with such enthusiasm, doesn't he? A little vigorous, perhaps. The nectar bruises so easily. Bruises, nectar, or shell. Observe him presenting a goblet to Artemis, and later comment, he seems to hesitate, doesn't he? A cupbearer should anticipate a deity's needs, not merely react. He always had such an intuitive grasp of divine thirst. Hera once commented, with icy sweetness, that Ganymede's pouring technique when serving her directly had all the grace of a startled heron attempting to serve ambrosia during a minor earthquake. Poor Ganymede, who was trying his absolute best under the terrifying scrutiny of the Queen of Heaven, nearly dropped the entire golden pitcher. These aren't genuine concerns about the quality of beverage service on Olympus. Of course, the nectar is still divine, the ambrosia still ambrosial. What you are witnessing is a master class in indirect criticism, a thinly veiled jab aimed squarely at Zeus' seemingly minor fault. Hera finds in Ganymede's service. He's too slow, he's too quick, his smile is perhaps a shade too familiar for a mere servant. He doesn't quite chill the nectar to the precise microdegree favored by Poseidon. Is a carefully aimed dart hitting Zeus's judgment, his motivations, and his blatant favoritism? When Hera says, one does wonder about the training these new recruits receive, she's not actually offering to mentor Ganymede in the finer points of goblet polishing. She's saying, you hired him because he's pretty, Zeus, and frankly, it shows. He's disrupting the perfectly adequate system we had with my daughter. Hera's critiques of Ganymede's ambrosia serving were less about the ambrosia and more about Zeus's Zeus-like hiring practices. It was like a divine achar complaint artfully disguised within a series of remarks about minor potential spillage and suboptimal serving temperatures, naturally leaps to Ganymede's defense, which only adds fuel to Hera's elegantly contained fire. Nonsense, my dear. He might boom, clapping Ganymede on the shoulder with a camaraderie that makes Hera's eyes narrow. The boy has spirit, a fresh energy. He's a quick learner. When Hera subtly pointed out that Ganymede, in his youthful nervousness, had accidentally served Zeus a goblet of nectar, usually reserved for Hades, a particularly gloomy vintage tasting strongly of regret and pomegranate seeds, Zeus, after a brief, surprised sip, merely declared it an interesting and bold change of pace, and loudly complimented Ganymede's innovative spirit in diversifying the Olympian palate. Ganymede, bless his beautiful, terrified heart, just tries to look grateful for five. The save while avoiding Hera's laser-like gaze. Scholarly analysis of the Ganymede myth often grapples with its complex social implications, touching upon ancient Greek attitudes toward pederasty, the arbitrary nature of divine power, and the frequent usurpation of traditional roles and honors. Hera's indignant reaction in these narratives is frequently cited by scholars as representing the voice of established social propriety and the sanctity of familial order being challenged by Zeus's personal desires. Her annoyance isn't just personal jealousy. It's a queen defending the established protocols of her court and family against the whims of its king. You might even see her extend her critique to how Ganymede interacts with other aspects of Olympian life, perhaps even Zeus's problematic ego. I notice young Ganymede now has the task of feeding Etos. She might remark, her voice deceptively mild, an important responsibility. One hopes the ego doesn't overwhelm him, or that Ganymede doesn't inadvertently teach it any further bad habits. It has so many already. The implication, of course, is that neither Zeus's pet nor his pet cupbearer are up to her standards. There were some rather high-minded allegorical interpretations of the Ganymede myth, particularly popular among the later Neoplatonist philosophers, which suggested that Ganymede actually represented the pure human soul aspiring to union with the divine, with Zeus's abduction being a metaphor for spiritual enlightenment and elevation to a higher state of being. You can imagine Hera hearing such a theory, perhaps from a visiting mortal sage, and letting out a very unqueenly snort. Spiritual elevation. Zeus hadn't elevated Ganymede's soul so much as his job description, and primarily for reasons far more earthly than ethereal. So, the feasting halls of Olympus become a stage for these quiet, coded skirmishes. Ganymede, caught in the crossfire, probably develops an ulcer, or at least a very keen ability to sense Hera's mood by the subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure around her throne. He, meanwhile, likely watches from the sidelines, a picture of demure filial piety, but perhaps with a small understanding smirk playing on her lips as her mother finds yet another imaginative way to critique her father's latest questionable personnel decision. The nectar continues to flow, sometimes with a slight. Hera noticed wobble, each pore a tiny symbol of the ongoing mundane power plays in the divine household. The subtle, almost imperceptible tremors of disapproval you saw Hera direct at Ganymede's less than perfect nectar pouring were, as you've gathered, less about the young cupbearer himself, and more about the king who appointed him. Zeus's judgment, or rather his frequent lack thereof when it came to personnel and personal favorites, is a recurring theme in Hera's catalogue of quiet grievances. This frustration naturally extends beyond just the household staff. It spills over, quite literally, sometimes into the broader social sphere of Olympus. The divine guest list, if Zeus couldn't be trusted to select a cupbearer based on merit rather than mere charm. You can imagine Hera's despair when it came to his choices for who should attend their Olympian soiree, as queen of the gods and the preeminent Olympian hostess. Hera, you understand, has certain standards. She envisions their divine gatherings as stately affairs, reflecting the majesty, order, and, well, the godliness of their court. Think elegant music from Apollo and the Muses, playing their classical hits, none of that newfangled Dionysian stuff, refined conversation, and nectar served in impeccably polished goblets by cupbearers who don't spill, looking at you, Ganymede, or rather, looking at Zeus, got through Ganymede. Zeus, however, often has a rather different concept of what makes a good party. His approach to invitations seems to be a mix of political expediency, nostalgic affection for old, uncouth comrades from the Titanomachy days, and a genuine, almost childlike amusement with beings who are, let's say, less refined. Zeus's criteria for a good party guest seem to be, are they currently breathing or immortally existing? And do they owe me a favor, find me vaguely impressive, or tell a good earthy joke? Hera's criteria were more along the lines of will they use a coaster for their ambrosia, and are they likely to mistake the horn of Amalthea, the cornucopia of plenty, for a beer stein, or, gods forbid, an impromptu drum? So, you witness Hera, a picture of regal composure on the outside, inwardly cringing as Zeus welcomes his latest questionable invites. Perhaps it's a delegation of shaggy, boisterous mountain gods who smell faintly of damp goat and track mud from their primordial peaks onto her freshly polished marble floors, or might be bits, a clutch of minor river deities, perpetually dripping and leaving damp patches on the celestial upholstery, who insist on regaling the assembled gods with long, meandering tales of local flood patterns. And then there are the newly minted demigod heroes, fresh from some messy monster slaying, still reeking of gore and glory, utterly bewildered by the social niceties of the divine court and prone to brandishing their blood-stained weapons at inappropriate moments. Zeus, of course, claps them on the back, calls them diamonds in the rough, and encourages them to tell us all about that Hydra business, lad, while Hera subtly signals for a serving nymph to bring extra cleaning supplies, and perhaps a very large air freshener made of condensed rainbows. The real problem, from Hera's perspective, isn't just the lack of social grace, it's the diplomatic headaches that inevitably follow. Headaches that only she seemed to notice or feel compelled to remedy. While Zeus is heartily encouraging a group of musically challenged satyrs to demonstrate their traditional panpipe battle cries, ear-splitting volume, blissfully unaware of the mounting social carnage, Hera is often engaged in delicate damage control. You might see her subtly steering a slightly inebriated and very large centaur, invited by Zeus for old time's sake, away from a brewing argument with Ares over who had the better war cry, or she's trying to tactfully explain to a highly dignified delegation of astral deities from a distant galaxy why a minor, earthbound god of Myodu, another of Zeus's interesting acquaintances, appears to be attempting to take root in the hall's expensive velvet drapes, after one particularly wild gathering where a Thracian wind god got a bit too enthusiastic, demonstrating his gale force lung capacity. Hera likely had to dispatch Hermes with apology notes to 3 different river nymphs, whose hairstyles were permanently altered, a minor cloud deity who was blown all the way to Ethiopia, and the entire constellation of Orion for unforeseen rustic exuberance and atmospheric disturbances. Theoxenia was an important and widespread Greek religious ritual, a concept where gods were believed to be truly present as honored guests at sacrificial feasts hosted by mortals. This idea of divine guestship, even when mortals were the hosts, implies a certain expected level of decorum and reverence. Hera, no doubt, felt this should apply even more stringently when the gods were hosting Zeus on Olympus. Yet, Zeus's open-door policy often seemed to operate on a the more, the merrier, and the messier, the better principle. She might try to institute some sort of vetting process for Olympian guest lists, perhaps a protocol for divine gatherings and maintenance of celestial harmony. Zeus would invariably dismiss such sensible proposals as too much Olympian bureaucracy, my dear, or claim it would stifle the vital, spontaneous joy of our divine fellowship. Wit, Hera noted, often looked a lot like a food fight, with thunderbolts as a potential garnish. It's a quirky but relevant tidbit that some of the most enduring ancient Greek literature, particularly the comedies of playwrights like Aristophanes, frequently depicted the gods in very human, often hilariously undignified situations, including unruly feasting and petty squabbles. While satirical, the popularity of such portrayals suggesting cultural trope of gods not always behaving with perfect, solemn divinity. This was precisely the kind of public image Hera was constantly battling against within her own home, trying to maintain a modicum of Olympian dignity, while Zeus seemed determined to invite every Rabelaisian character from the cosmic fringes. You can imagine Hera, after one particularly trying evening involving a troupe of over-caffeinated Corybantes and a mysteriously sticky floor, attempting to discuss the matter with Zeus. "My dearest thunder-wielder," she might begin, her voice carefully neutral, "while I appreciate your desire for inclusivity, perhaps inviting Kakia, the very personification of vice and immorality, to demonstrate her alternative ethical frameworks during Thief Ambrosia course was not conducive to a harmonious digestive experience for our other guests." Zeus would likely just laugh, say Kakia was thought-provoking, and added a bit of spice, completely missing the point that several elder gods had turned a rather alarming shade of green. Classicists and anthropologists continue to explore the degree to which ancient Greek portrayals of divine gatherings, ranging from the profound solemnity of Theoxenia right to the ecstatic, boundary-dissolving raucousness of Dionysian revels, reflected actual human social practices and anxieties, versus serving as purely imaginative or theological constructs about the complex, often contradictory nature of the gods themselves. For Hera, however, the debate is far from academic. It's her reality, her eternal struggle to keep the Olympian house in order, both literally and metaphorically, against the tide of her husband's often baffling social choices. The clatter of dropped goblets, the off-key singing of a drunken Silenus, the faint but persistent smell of swamp gas from someone minor, chronic deity, Zeus thought would be an interesting conversationalist. These are the mundane sounds and scents of her ongoing, unacknowledged diplomatic labor, the endless parade of Zeus's questionable Olympian party guests. Those shaggy mountain gods and dripping river deities you saw Hera patiently managing often leaves a residue of social exhaustion in its wake. You can imagine Hera, after a particularly trying evening spent preventing inter-deity brawls over the last dregs of ambrosia, or tactfully discouraging a group of overly enthusiastic fawns from starting an impromptu bonfire in the hall of Hebe, just yearning for a bit of peace. But peace, like an empty appointment book for Zeus, is a rare commodity on Olympus, and often the diplomatic headaches caused by his invited guests are swiftly followed by the more personal, throbbing migraine of his uninvited dalliances. Whispers begin, as they always do, like a faint, unsettling breeze rustling the leaves of the sacred olive trees in Hera's private garden. Gossip on Olympus, you understand, travels faster than Hermes, with a fresh pair of winged sandals and a particularly juicy secret. It flits on the wings of mischievous wind nymphs, bubbles up from the chatter of gossipy naiads in their springs, and is sometimes even written in the nervous twitching of a guilty-looking minor deities. Left eyebrow. Bye-bye. Lunchtime. Every narrated from here to Naxos probably knew about Zeus's latest bovine phase. This time, the name echoing through the celestial corridors carried on sighs and suppressed giggles. Is Europa, a Phoenician princess, they murmur, of remarkable beauty, dwelling by the sea, and the method of courtship? A magnificent snow-white bull, gentle of eye, but with an unnervingly regal bearing, that lured her onto its back and then swam away with her, all the way to Crete. You see Rhea hearing these murmurs. At first, she might try to dismiss them. Another flight of fancy, another overblown tale from some excitable local deity. She's heard it all before. But the details become too precise. The sources too numerous. The image of Zeus, king of the gods, transforming himself into livestock, however handsome the bull. To woo a mortal girl is both ludicrous and, for Hera, deeply, personally insulting. The abduction of Europa by Zeus in the form of a white bull is, of course, one of his most famous and artistically rendered exploits. This Phoenician princess was indeed spirited away to Crete, where she bore him several notable sons, including Minos and Rhadamanthus, and legend has it, lent her name to an entire continent. So, the whispers aren't just idle fancy, they have the uncomfortable ring of impending mythological fact, with a familiar weariness settling upon her regal features. Hera decides to approach Zeus. No accusations, not yet, just a carefully phrased inquiry. You can picture the scene. Zeus is perhaps admiring a new constellation he's been sketching out, or practicing his authoritative thunderclap. Volume level, moderate. Hera enters, calm, composed, but with an invisible aura of "we need to talk" that could chill nectar at 20 paces. My Lord Zeus, she begins, her voice impeccably even. There are certain murmurings that have reached my ears, something concerning a young princess from Phoenicia, and a rather conspicuous, if undeniably handsome, white bull. Zeus, you observe, doesn't even have the good grace to look momentarily flustered. He launches directly into his well-rehearsed repertoire of dismissals, denials, and diversions. Europa, he might say with an air of thoughtful benevolence. Yes, charming girl, from that lovely stretch of coastline, terribly keen on, advanced bovine studies. As I recall, very spirited. White bull, you say, my dear? How truly extraordinary. Must be one of Poseidon's new prize-winning herd, perhaps. You know how he fancies his livestock. I should ask him about it when Hera presses, mentioning the rather un-Poseidon-like detail of the bull carrying the princess across the sea to Crete. Zeus might pivot to feign concern. To Crete, you say? On a bull? Good heavens, that sounds perilous. We must dispatch Hermes at once to ensure her safety. These adventurous modern princesses, really. Zeus's attempts to deny the Europa incident are so unconvincing. He might as well have shown up to dinner, still vaguely smelling of sea salt and premium bull conditioner, humming Phoenician sea shanties under his breath. It's these dismissals, so flimsy and predictable, that become utterly infuriating for Hera. It is not just the infidelity itself. That's a wound she carries with a weary, ancient pain. It's the insult to her intelligence, The blithe assumption that she, Hera, queen of Famshon, that she, Olympus, goddess of marriage, would be fooled by such transparently ridiculous deflections. He might even try a touch of gaslighting, a classic from his playbook. My dearest Hera, you seem a little overwrought. All these responsibilities, the endless Olympian guest lists. Perhaps you're imagining things, letting a few idle whispers upset your usually impeccable judgment. The interpretation of the Europa myth varies widely among scholars. Some view it as a straightforward, if somewhat problematic, tale of divine lust and abduction. Others delve deeper, exploring its potential as a complex foundation myth, symbolizing the transmission of culture and civilization from the sophisticated East, Phoenicia, to the nascent West, Crete and mainland Greece, or even as an astronomical allegory relating to constellations. Hera's perspective, however, likely focused entirely on the more terrestrial, marital, and deeply irritating implications of her husband, once again cavorting in animal form. She listens, her expression unreadable, but you can see the slow tightening of her jaw, the dangerous glint in her eyes that means her divine patience is wearing perilously thin. He's not even trying anymore. His excuses are recycled, his evasions almost lazy, writs a quirky and somewhat telling detail that on many ancient vase paintings depicting the scene Europa doesn't always appear terrified during her unconventional sea voyage. Sometimes she's shown calmly riding the bull, even adorning its horns with flowers, or holding on with a sense of curious adventure rather than abject fear. This alternative artistic interpretation, suggesting a degree of compliance, or at least a remarkable lack of panic from Europa, might make Zeus's dismissive "she's keen on bovine studies" comment even more galling to Hera, as if implying the princess was a willing participant in his ludicrous charade. When Zeus tried to suggest the white bull was just part of an innovative agricultural outreach program designed to improve international bovine relations, Hera's stare became so icy, minor frost spirits in the immediate vicinity caught a severe cold and had to be sent to Helios's solarium to thaw out. The charade is what infuriates her most. The expectation that she will simply absorb these insults, these blatant lies, continue to preside over his feasts and manage his household as if nothing is amiss. Each unconvincing denial is another small chip at the foundations of their sacred marriage, another echo of countless similar conversations, another log on the fire of her simmering, righteous anger. The whispers about Europa will eventually fade, replaced by other names, other transformations, but the pattern of Zeus's behavior and Hera's weary, infuriated reaction to his insulting dismissals remains a constant, tedious refrain in the symphony of their immortal discontent, the acrid aftertaste of Zeus's flimsy excuses regarding Europa. Those unconvincing dismissals you saw him offer with such practiced ease tends to leave Hera with a particular kind of infuriated energy when direct confrontation about his infidelities proves as fruitful as trying to nail ambrosia to a cloud. Her focus often shifts to areas where she feels she shall have some semblance of control, some way to impose order on the inherent chaos that seems to trail in Zeus's wake, and what better, more tangible project to absorb that frustrated queenly drive than a grand, systematic decluttering of their divine abode. After all, if your husband is metaphorically cluttering up your marriage with his endless indiscretions, perhaps tidying up the literal millennia of accumulated divine junk in the Olympian storerooms might offer a small symbolic victory. You can imagine the state of these celestial attics and basements, Olympus isn't just a palace. It's an eternal repository. Think of the accumulated bric-a-brac, slightly singed practice, thunderbolts from Zeus's early throwing days, discarded disguises. Hera would probably pay good nectar to accidentally incinerate that infamous white bull costume from the Europa incident. Tarnished trophies from forgotten skirmishes with obscure pre-Olympian entities, mountains of votive offerings from mortals, some touching, some frankly baffling, broken lyres, dented helmets, robes of office for deities who haven't been seen in eons, and probably several lifetimes' worth of Zeus's half-finished brilliant inventions that never quite got off the drawing board. Zeus was the original divine harder. He had thunderbolts in there, dating back to the early Bronze Age, that he insisted were vintage and might come back into fashion. Hera suspected he just couldn't remember what half of it was for, or which nymph he'd been trying to impress with it at the time. So Hera, ever the champion of order and perhaps desperately needing a constructive outlet, unveils her grand Olympian decluttering initiative. You see her with scrolls detailing new shelving units crafted by Hephaestus, earthquake-proof, naturally, plans for a clear cataloging system, perhaps organized by divine attribute or by things Zeus will never miss, and a determined glint in her eye she envisions gleaming. Organized storerooms where every artifact has its place, every dusty relic is either honorably displayed or respectfully decommissioned. She approached the great Olympian declutter with the strategic planning of a military campaign. Phase 1. Identify and isolate Zeus's sentimental piles of junk, which seem to encompass roughly 90% of all matter on Olympus. Phase 2. Attempt to reason with Zeus. This phase usually failed by mid-morning, often before the second cup of mid-morning nectar. This is where her noble plan hits the immovable object of Zeus's monumental lack of interest, and his even more monumental refusal to cooperate when Hera presents her beautifully drafted proposal for overhauling storage vault Gamma 7, currently overflowing with what Zeus calls important atmospheric event souvenirs. He just yawns. Decluttering, my dearest Hera, he might say, idly watching a passing cloud that reminds him of a particularly charming dryad he met last Tuesday. Is that truly how the Queen of Heaven, my radiant consort, wishes to occupy her immortal aeons? There's a rather fascinating dispute brewing between two minor sea gods over a particularly shiny pearl I was just about to mediate, far more engaging than dust, when she persists, pointing out that some of the older, unstable magical artifacts might pose a hazard, or that they're running out of room for new, historically significant items, like, say, her own collection of perfectly preserved olive branches from every peace treaty ever signed. His passive indifference morphs into active stonewalling, that moth-eaten lion skin draped over a pile of dented breastplates. Ah, but that, my love, Zeus would exclaim with a dramatic sigh, is the very first Nemean lion skin I acquired, positively brimming with sentimental value. And, Hera notes, also positively brimming with actual, very hungry divine moths. Those racks of slightly bent, experimental thunderbolts that fizzle rather than flash. Works in progress, Hera. Vital research into alternative lightning delivery systems. One can't rush genius. He forbids her from touching wish-specific, sacred piles of divine detritus, which, as far as Hera can tell, constitute most of the known universe's clutter. It's a fascinating mainstream historical fact that ancient Greek temples and major sanctuaries, much like Olympus in our tale, often accumulated vast quantities of votive offerings over centuries, countless statues, precious metal objects, weapons, and terracotta figurines dedicated by hopeful or grateful mortals. Sacred accumulation was a real logistical challenge for temple priests and authorities, sometimes leading to carefully orchestrated ritual burials of older or damaged items within the sacred precinct to make space, because simply throwing them away was often considered sacrilegious. Hera's problem with Zeus's hoard, therefore, has a very real world, if divinely scaled, parallel. She probably wished she could orchestrate a ritual burial for half of Zeus's collection. Her frustration is palpable. You can almost feel her sigh as she surveys a cavernous storeroom that looks like a divine flea market exploded. It's not just about the mess, it's another front in the ongoing war of ignored concerns. The clutter becomes symbolic of ignored symbolica. Their marriage, crammed with Zeus's unaddressed baggage, his refusal to let go of the past, especially his more roguish parts, and his complete disregard for her efforts to create a harmonious, well-managed shared existence. Archaeologists often debate the precise purpose and perceived sanctity of so-called sacred clutter found in temple repositories, whether every single fragment was deemed inviolably holy and untouchable, or if, much like Hera attempting to negotiate with Zeus over a pile of rusty celestial spears, pragmatic decisions about curation, disposal, and reorganization were sometimes made by temple authorities, albeit very discreetly, and with appropriate ritual. Hera would argue for pragmatism, Zeus for the sanctity of every last cobweb-draped gewgaw, worky, and for Hera, perhaps useful, tidbit found in some obscure magical lore suggests that certain divine or enchanted items, if not stored correctly, respectfully, or with the proper ambient enchantments, could gradually lose their potency, leak unpredictable magical energies, or even develop mischievous personalities, and cause minor chaos. Hera might have tried this angle. Zeus, dearest, that collection of captured Gorgon heads in the South Vault. No, if we don't properly reward their containment unit, they might start accidentally petrifying the cleaning Cyclops again. And you know how hard good Cyclops help is to find these days. Zeus would probably just tell her to tell the Cyclops not to look. Ultimately, the Olympian storerooms remain a glorious, chaotic testament to Zeus's inability to throw anything away and Hera's eternal uphill battle for a little divine feng shui. It was less storage wars and more storage code wars and more storage code wars, with occasional skirmishes over a particularly rusty trident or a suspiciously sentient cloak. You see Hera perhaps managing to carve out one small, impeccably organized corner for her own belongings, the rest of the vast space a monument to her husband's enduring ability to simply not care about the things that mattered to her, especially if they involved effort on his part. Another grand plan quietly shelved, another layer of dust settling not just on old relics, but on Hera's hopes for a truly shared, orderly reign. The monumental task of trying to declutter Olympus, of attempting to bring a semblance of order to millennia of Zeus's accumulated divine memorabilia, as you've seen, often leaves Hera feeling like Sisyphus with a celestial feather duster. Sheer weight of his indifference to her efforts, his stubborn refusal to part with even the most dilapidated Thunderbolt prototype, naturally adds another layer to her well-justified exasperation. And as the Olympian day gives way to night, great dusty storerooms are temporarily forgotten. Hera finds herself confronting another, even more personal and inescapable emanation of Zeus's majestic thoughtlessness, the snores of a god. Yes, you heard that right. The king of the gods, wielder of lightning, the master of the cosmos, snores. and not just a delicate kingly rumble, a gentle sighing of the divine cynices. Oh no, Zeus doesn't just snore. He conducts nocturnal symphonies of nasal cataclysm. You can imagine FIFA sound echoing through the vast silent halls of their Olympian bedchamber, a sound that could rival the distant grumbling of Mount Etna, the rhythmic crashing of Poseidon's stormiest waves, or perhaps the Cyclops engaging in a rather enthusiastic game of celestial ten-pin bowling down in the forge. The minor gods, dwelling on the lower slopes of Olympus, often mistook it for an impending volcanic eruption or a particularly disgruntled titan attempting a jailbreak from the depths of Tartarus. For Hera, lying beside him in the immense, cloud-stuffed royal bed, it's nothing short of torture. How is a queen meant to get her beauty sleep? To contemplate the subtle shifts in cosmic balance, or even just to enjoy a moment of blessed quiet, when the very air beside her vibrates with the force of a contained hurricane? You observe her, night after night, enduring this auditory onslaught. Perhaps she tries the subtle approach first, a gentle nudge to his divine ribs, a delicate clearing of her throat that could, in daylight hours, halt a charging minotaur in its tracks. When these prove as effective as trying to polish a thunderbolt with a cloud, she might resort to more direct, if still dignified, tactics, like artfully rearranging the celestial bedpillows into a configuration that ever so slightly alters his sleeping position. In the mornings, over their ambrosia and nectar, the good stuff, if Zeus hasn't pilfered it all, as you've seen him wont to do, she might attempt to address the issue. She'd begin, her voice carefully modulated. Your nocturnal pronouncements were particularly resonant last night. The very foundations of the West Wing seemed to hum in sympathy. Zeus, looking refreshed and entirely oblivious, would likely peer at her in mild surprise. Snore, me, my radiant Hera, had reply, a picture of affronted innocence. The king of the gods does not snore. I breathe with Olympian authority. Perhaps it was the distant song of the celestials you heard, my love, or maybe that new batch of nectar was a bit more robust than usual. When Hera presented what she considered irrefutable audio evidence, perhaps a cleverly captured echo reverberating within a giant, ancient conch shell she'd placed strategically by the bedside, Zeus would confidently claim it was unusual atmospheric interference from a passing comet, or possibly Poseidon enthusiastically testing out a new sea monster vocalization from the depths. Anything, absolutely anything, but admit that he, Zeus, sounded like a cyclops gargling boulders in his sleep. Even if some minuscule part of his divine consciousness acknowledged a slight nocturnal rumble, his attitude would be one of supreme indifference. Well, my dear, he might concede with a magnanimous wave of his hand, if my breathing is a trifle remphatic for your delicate ears, perhaps you are simply a light sleeper. Have you tried counting thunderbolts, or might be a soothing cup of poppy-infused nectar before retiring? The implication, as always, is that the problem is hers, not his, snoring, like his wandering eye or his hoarding tendencies, is simply a part of his magnificent, unimpeachable being. And it is up to her to adjust. Myths detailing Zeus' snoring habits are, understandably, scarce, perhaps out of respect, or because ancient poets had bigger fish, or rather sea monsters, to fry. The ancient Greeks were certainly no strangers to the universal realities of sleep. Dreams, which they personified with deities like Hypnos, god of sleep, and his son Morpheus, shaper of dreams, and presumably the common household nuisance of a snoring bedfellow, Depictions of sleeping figures are quite common in their art, though they tend to be portrayed with a more serene, less sonically disruptive repose than Zeus likely managed. Rook Hera, you can imagine, seriously considered more drastic measures, perhaps soundproofing their entire royal bedchamber with a leftover Titan-suppressing shields and several layers of densely packed storm clouds, or maybe commissioning Hephaestus to invent divine noise-canceling earplugs, possibly fashioned from the wool of rare, silent moon sheep, or enchanted pearls from the deepest, quietest parts of Oceanus' realm. Short of that, she mostly just glared at him in the dark, a silent, sleepless vigil fueled by mounting resentment. It's the sheer, inescapable, nightly recurrence of the issue that grates on her divine nerves. She can't tidy this problem away into a storeroom, or delegate it to a minor nymph. It's there, every night, a thunderous testament to his obliviousness. Work quirky and rather charming tidbit from some ancient folk beliefs and interpretations of dreams suggested that exceptionally loud snoring could sometimes be attributed to the snorer being temporarily possessed by a minor, mischievous woodland spirit having a bit of fun, or as a sign that the individual was experiencing particularly potent or even troublesome dream, perhaps wrestling with unseen demons in their sleep. Hera might have listened to Zeus's cacophony and sarcastically mused that he was likely dreaming of new, inventive ways to annoy her, or perhaps reenacting his more boisterous conquests in his sleep, complete with sound effects. Sleep researchers today meticulously study the complex physiological and environmental factors that contribute to snoring, but for the ancient Greeks, profound sleep and its various disturbances, especially for a figure as cosmically significant as Zeus, might have carried additional connotations that scholars are still exploring. Perhaps his thunderous breathing was perceived by some as being linked to the very rhythms of the cosmos he commanded, or as an echo of the raw, untamed, elemental aspects of his powerful divine nature. A less comforting thought for anyone trying to sleep next to it, that true for Hera, though it wasn't cosmic or elemental, was just infuriatingly loud. This unaddressed grievance, the nightly sonic assault, becomes another entry on her ever-expanding list, another testament to Zeus's majestic indifference to her comfort and peace, even within the supposed sanctity of their share Olympian night. The nightly ordeal of Zeus's thunderous snoring, that inescapable sonic imposition you've witnessed Hera endure with rapidly dwindling patience, often leaves the Queen of Olympus feeling weary and decidedly unrested come morning, when even the sanctity of sleep is invaded by her husband's majestic inconsideration. You can imagine Hera seeking other avenues within her domestic sphere to exert some influence, to introduce a little novelty, or simply to feel like her preferences matter. What could be more fundamental, more daily, than the very food and drink of the gods, ambrosia and nectar? After millennia of the same celestial menu, day in and day out, perhaps Hera yearns for a little culinary innovation, a dash of gastronomic excitement. Zeus, however, is a deity of deeply entrenched habits, especially when it comes to his meals. You observe Hera, perhaps inspired by a new spice brought back by Hermes from his travels to the exotic East, or by observing the ingenious ways mortals are learning to combine flavors, approaching the Olympian kitchens with a thoughtful expression. She might gently suggest to the head Cyclops chef, a surprisingly delicate culinary artist, despite his single eye and massive, calloused hands, a new twist on the standard ambrosia. Perhaps, she muses, we could try infusing the ambrosia with a hint of sun-ripened Thessalian figs today. Or what about a nectar reduction with a whisper of wild mountain mint? She envisions subtle variations, delightful surprises for the divine palate, a way to elevate the eternal routine of God feasting. The divine chefs, ever eager to please their queen, and perhaps a little bored themselves of churning out the same Olympus standard ambrosia for the past few centuries, might embrace these suggestions with enthusiasm. New aromas begin to waft from the celestial kitchens. Ambrosia baked with starfruit essences, nectar chilled with ice from the highest, purest Olympian peaks, and garnished with edible moon-petal flowers. Hera anticipates, with a small flicker of hope, that perhaps this small change, this gentle introduction of variety, might be met with appreciation, even from her notoriously tradition-bound husband. But then Zeus arrives for dinner. He surveys the subtly different ambrosia, perhaps a new golden hue from the fig infusion or a delicate scent of mint accompanying his nectar. He pauses, he sniffs. You can almost see the gears of suspicion grinding in his divine mind. "What? What's this, my dear?" he might ask, his brow furrowed. "The ambrosia seems different." Hera, with carefully cultivated nonchalance, explains her modest culinary experiment. "Just a slight variation, my king. A touch of fig to enhance its natural sweetness. Thought it might be a pleasant change." Zeus pokes at the new ambrosia with his golden fork, as if it might leap up and smite him. Zeus's palate was so traditional, he probably thought adding a sprig of parsley to the ambrosia was dangerously avant-garde. "What's next, Hera?" I'd grumble, eyeing delicately sculpted ambrosia, quenelle, cubes of solidified cloud in our nectar, garnishes made from the beards of defeated titans. Madness, I tell you. Sheer culinary anarchy. He then makes a great show of requesting a serving of the classic ambrosia, the real ambrosia, the kind his grandmother Rhea supposedly wrestled from the very fabric of creation, a detail of highly dubious accuracy, but one Zeus is fond of. "There's no need to temper with perfection, Hera," he booms, taking a large, appreciative mouthful of the standard issue got chow. "This is the sustenance that fueled our victory over the Titans. This is the ambrosia of champions." Hera once tried to introduce ambrosia a la Titan, a hearty, rustic version she thought might appeal to his nostalgic side, perhaps with more rough-hewn chunks. Zeus examined it with profound suspicion, poked it several times with his scepter, and then asked if it was a new type of edible shield he hadn't been briefed on. And so an ambrosia recipe stalemate ensues. The divine chefs on Olympus learned to navigate this delicate culinary Cold War by preparing two versions of many key dishes. Hera's interesting ambrosial experiment that might actually taste delicious and offer a welcome departure from monotony, and Zeus's unwavering mountain of standard-issue god food, exactly as it was in the Golden Age. No surprises, please. Guess which one usually got devoured first, with great demonstrative smacking of lips by the king of the gods? While the precise mythical recipe for ambrosia and nectar remains tantalizingly unknown, often described simply as incredibly sweet, fragrant, and bestowing immortality, ancient Greeks themselves possessed a surprisingly sophisticated and varied culinary tradition. Archaeological evidence and ancient texts reveal a diet rich in grains, olives, figs, cheese, fish, and specific ways of preparing meats for feasts, which were incredibly important social and religious occasions. God's diet, though simple in its literary description, was always imagined as the absolute pinnacle of perfection and pleasure. Hera's desire to experiment wasn't entirely out of sync with a culture that valued good food, even if Zeus himself preferred the divine equivalent of meat and potatoes every single night for eternity. Food historians and classicists often debate whether the legendary simplicity of ambrosia and nectar in the myths, often just described by its effects or its delightful scent rather than specific ingredients, reflects an early, less gastronomically developed stage of Greek culinary imagination, or, more intriguingly, a deliberate theological choice. By making the gods' sustenance fundamentally unique, unreplicable, and perhaps even undescribable in mortal terms, it underscored their separation from and superiority to mortals, thus naturally resisting any gourmet elaboration or recipe tinkering. Hera, however, clearly felt that even divine perfection could use a little seasonal variation. This stubborn insistence on the classic menu becomes another unaddressed grievance for Hera. It's not just about the food itself. It's about his refusal to acknowledge her creativity, her desire to contribute to their shared life in a new way, his dismissal of her tastes and preferences. It's another small way he asserts his dominance, his resistance to any change, even one as benign as a new flavor of ambrosia, quirky, almost alchemical, fringe idea found in some later mystical traditions and Neoplatonic commentaries, speculated that ambrosia wasn't necessarily a fixed substance, but might possess the ability to subtly change its flavor, or even its properties based on the divine will of the imbiber, or in harmony with specific celestial alignments or sacred festivals. If such a belief had any currency on Olympus, Hera might have argued that her desire for variety wasn't just whimsy, but an attempt to attune their divine diet to the ever-changing cosmic rhythms, a sophisticated argument Zeus would have likely dismissed with a bewildered grunt before calling for more of the usual. You can see Hera, after another failed attempt to introduce, say, nectar, with a hint of dawn dew gathered by Zephyrus himself, sighing inwardly as Zeus contentedly munches on his plain, unadorned but Zeus-approved ambrosia. The Olympian kitchens become yet another silent battleground in their long, mundane domestic war with the scent of intriguing, untasted possibilities often being overpowered by the familiar, unchanging aroma of tradition, stubbornly upheld by a king who knew what he liked and liked what he knew, especially if it required no thought or adaptation on his part. The great ambrosia recipe stalemate you just witnessed, with Zeus stubbornly clinging to his classic divine menu and dismissing Hera's attempts at culinary innovation, is yet another course in the long, unsatisfying banquet of their marital disagreements, millennia of such dismissals, of her concern being ignored, from the grand decor of Olympus down to the very snores emanating from the royal bedchamber, have a cumulative effect. Direct confrontation, as Hera has learned through bitter, repetitive experience, rarely yields the desired results with the king of the gods. So, you begin to observe a subtle shift in the queen's tactics, a quiet evolution from voiced complaints to almost imperceptible acts of domestic rebellion, tiny ripples of inconvenience designed to disturb the placid surface of Zeus's majestic self-absorption. These are not grand, theatrical acts of vengeance. Those are for the more dramatic myths, the ones involving transformed cows and hundred-eyed guardians. No, this is the realm of mundane domestic disputes, and Hera's sabotage is appropriately, exquisitely mundane. Her simmering frustration, a pot left on the divine hearth for too long, finds its outlet in these small, deniable inconveniences. She's not aiming for a coup d'etat on Olympus with her tiny rebellions. She's perhaps just hoping for that infinitesimal chance that Zeus might finally pause, notice that something is vaguely, inexplicably off, perhaps, just perhaps, ask, "Is everything all right, dear?" Of course, you realize that moment is about as likely as Hades developing a sudden passion for tap dancing and organizing a spring recital in the underworld. You might see her, with an air of utmost innocence, accidentally misplacing Zeus's favorite thunderbolt polishing cloth just moments before he decides the skies need a bit of impromptu pyrotechnics. Or perhaps the water in his personal bathing pool within their private Olympian suite is, on certain particularly trying days for Hera, a degree or two cooler than his preferred temperature. Not enough to cause a divine outcry, just enough to elicit a brief, surprised shiver and a frown. When he mentions it, Hera would look at him with wide, innocent eyes and say, "Cooler, my love, how very strange. The nymphs of the sacred spring assured me it was heated to your exact specifications. Perhaps a rogue current from one of Poseidon's experiments. Her acts of subtle, domestic sabotage are so finely calibrated. Zeus probably just assumes the universe is having a slightly off day, or that some minor deity in charge of atmospheric minutiae is sleeping on the job." He'd muse, looking up from his nectar. "My favorite napping cloud seems to be drifting 3 centimeters further to the left today. Most peculiar cosmic alignment. Must have words with Aeolus about these unpredictable micro-breezes." He would never suspect that Hera had a quiet word with a sympathetic wind nymph earlier that morning. Remember the Olympian clutter you saw her valiantly trying to organize in Section 11? While Zeus stonewalled any major decluttering, Hera might now engage in a little strategic rearrangement of his less critical, but still sentimentally hoarded items. That slightly chipped goblet he won in a dice game with Hermes eons ago. It might find itself at the very back of a very high shelf, behind a dusty collection of obsolete celestial maps. His third best ceremonial spear. Perhaps it accidentally gets used by one of the younger, clumsier Cyclopes as a poker for the forge fires, acquiring a new, slightly singed patina. Nothing overtly destructive, just inconveniently altered. Safe, that old, rather comfortable toga he favors for lounging about and informally judging mortal disputes. It might, through no fault of Hera's, of course, find its way into a laundry batch, being subjected to a particularly vigorous cleaning cycle by the Cyclopean laundry brigade, emerging slightly less comfortable, perhaps a shade less kingly. She became a master at the art of strategic misplacement. Zeus's spare lightning bolts, the ones for everyday, casual smiting, might turn up in the nectar pantry, mistaken for unusually shiny stirring rods. His divine GPS, the greater Olympian positioning system, likely a specially trained celestial bird, might be found inexplicably roosting with Aphrodite's doves, cooing peacefully and entirely off course. In ancient Greek society, as in many patriarchal cultures, women, particularly within the confines of the oikos, the household or family unit, often possessed limited direct power compared to their male counterparts. Influence, subtle persuasion, managing the household efficiently, and sometimes forms of passive resistance or quiet non-compliance were among the few avenues available to them to assert their will or express discontent within the domestic sphere. Hera's carefully calibrated, almost invisible acts of sabotage could be seen as a divine echo of these very real, very human strategies for navigating power imbalances. You might also consider the target of her subtle inconveniences, the eagle, Eidos Dios, Zeus's feathered favorite, whose egregious etiquette you saw vex Hera earlier. Perhaps its usual supply of ambrosia-soaked celestial mice runs out a day early, or the perch Hera knows Zeus prefers for it suddenly develops a mysterious, annoying wobble. Ganymede, the comely cupbearer, Hera might give him instructions for Zeus's nectar, that are just a tiny bit contradictory, leading to a brew that's not quite right, prompting a mild frown from the king. A frown Hera observes with quiet, hidden satisfaction. Aspect to some folk magic traditions across various cultures involving what one might call nuisance magic, minor spells or charms not intended to cause significant harm, but rather to subtly disrupt an individual's peace, create small annoyances, or make them more receptive to the spellcaster's underlying wishes. These often involve misplacing objects or creating minor discomforts. Actions, though entirely non-magical and relying on her intimate knowledge of Olympian routines and an Zeus habit, share a certain kinship with this principle of low-level, frustrating disruption. Scholars examining ancient texts for evidence of female agency, particularly in domestic or constrained settings, often debate whether actions, interpreted as passive resistance or subtle subversion, were conscious. Strategic choices aimed at achieving a specific outcome, or simply reflections of oppressed individuals coping with power imbalances through any means available. Being a powerful goddess in her own right, yet still subject to Zeus's authority and whims, adds another fascinating layer of complexity to this ongoing discussion. Hera, you suspect? It's a bit of both, a coping mechanism and a faint, desperate hope that these tiny, irritating grains of sand in Zeus's divine oyster might someday, somehow, produce a pearl of attentiveness. For now, though, each successful, unnoticed act of minor sabotage is a small, bitter victory, a silent, bitter victory. Protest in the unending, mundane domestic disputes of Olympus. Those tiny, almost imperceptible acts of domestic sabotage you saw Hera engage in, the strategically misplaced thunderbolt polishing cloth, the subtly altered ambrosia recipe, the mysteriously drafty window by Zeus's favorite napping cloud, offer her, perhaps, a fleeting sense of agency, a minuscule release valve for aeons of accumulated frustration. But these pinpricks of rebellion, you understand, do little to address the vast underlying mountain of ignored concerns and unacknowledged slice. And so, in the quiet solitude of her own queenly mind, or perhaps in a hidden chamber of Olympus, far from Zeus's oblivious gaze, you can almost see her unfurling it. The great, ever-expanding grievance scroll. This isn't necessarily a literal papyrus, though knowing Hera's meticulous nature and her appreciation for order, so often thwarted, it might very well be, more powerfully, is the mental catalog she keeps, an endless, meticulously annotated list of every minor marital issue, every disregarded opinion, every casual act of divine neglect that has characterized her long, long marriage to the king of the gods. Hera's mental grievance scroll was so long, if she ever decided to physically write it down using the finest celestial ink on nebula vellum, it would encircle Mount Olympus 3 times, dip down into the underworld for a brief audit of Hades, less egregious but still noteworthy spousal failings, for comparative purposes, of course, and still have enough length left over to serve as a finish line tape for the Olympic Games for the next 1,000 years. You watch as she mentally, or perhaps with a silent, ethereal stylus, adds new entries or reviews old ones. Each item is a testament to Zeus' unique brand of divine indifference. There's a lengthy chapter, you imagine, dedicated to pronouncements dubious from Dodona and other allegedly infallible oracles, with extensive footnotes on suspiciously convenient interpretations. Remember, those shifting oak-leaf messages from Section 2. Another section, heavily annotated, might be titled Festive Occasions, Anniversaries, and Other Significant Dates, consistently overlooked or inadequately acknowledged, a painful reminder of Zeus's recurring amnesia from Section 6. She probably has a whole subcategory for fauna, Olympian, mismanagement of, featuring detailed complaints about the egregious etiquette of a certain golden eagle. Section 7. Its molting seasons meticulously charted against important state visits. Catalan system, you'd guess, is impeccable, a masterpiece of divine archival science. Grievances are likely cross-referenced by date of offense, type of divine idiocy, e.g., amnesia, anniversary-related, recurring, personnel choices, questionable cupbearer division. A nod to Ganymede from Section 8, culinary conservatism, extreme stubbornness regarding for that ambrosia recipe, stalemate, in Section 13. And of course Zeus's level of feigned innocence or infuriating dismissal at the time of the infraction, like his handling of the Europa rumors, Section 10 ta. The scroll details the great palace decor discord, Section 4, where her attempts to bring aesthetic harmony were met with thunderous apathy. It chronicles the nectar-nicking suspicions, Section 5. Those times her private stock of celestial vintages mysteriously dwindled after Zeus entertained his special projects. There are notes on the uncouth divine guests, Section 9. He insisted on inviting, and the subsequent diplomatic headaches only she seemed equipped or willing to manage us. And who could forget the Olympian storage wars, Section 11? Her grand decluttering plans, stonewalled by his insistence that every piece of millennia-old junk was a priceless artifact. Even his snoring, Section 12, that nightly symphony of nasal catastrophe, has its own meticulously detailed entry, perhaps with decibel readings estimated by the trembling of nearby constellations. Her own recent forays into subtle domestic sabotage, Section 14, might even be recorded, a private addendum on coping mechanisms, active, minor efficacy noted. In many ancient legal and administrative systems, not least those of the Greeks and later the Romans, detailed record-keeping was absolutely crucial. Important decrees, treaties, financial accounts, and even private contracts were often inscribed on papyrus scrolls or wax tablets, preserved in archives as official records. Uras, Griavan scroll, in its own way, is her private, domitulous, if profoundly one-sided, record of a marriage under divine strain. It's her truth, carefully preserved against the tide of his forgetfulness and denial. Whenever Zeus introduces a new, charming acquaintance to the Olympian social scene, or misunderstands a fundamental principle of marital fidelity yet again, or simply ignores a perfectly reasonable request for the 1000th time, you can almost hear the mental scratch of Hera's stylus. She seems to think with a weary sigh that could chill the summer stars. Another chapter for the archives. Subsection, Predictable Disappointments, Volume 12, Part 734. Mythologists often discuss whether Hera's persistent portrayal as a discontented, sometimes vengeful, figure in many ancient myths serves primarily to highlight the inherent instability and power struggles within the Olympian divine family, or if it functions more broadly as a sophisticated, enduring commentary on the challenges, compromises, and often unequal dynamics inherent in the institution of marriage itself. When scaled up to a divine, immortal level, her scroll is the personal, itemized bill for those challenges. There's a quirky, somewhat charming ancient Greek concept, though not directly tied to Hera, of the Book of Fate or the Scroll of Destiny, said to be meticulously kept by the Moirai, the Fates, detailing the allotted lives and destinies of all mortals. Hera's personal scroll is a more intimate, localized, and grievance-focused version of such a cosmic record. It details not inevitable fate, but recurring, avoidable frustration, a chronicle of choices made mostly by Zeus, that lead to her quiet, queenly discontent. This mental, or perhaps actual, cataloging is not just an act of remembering. It's an act of self-preservation. In the face of Zeus's constant gaslighting, his selective memory, his profound ability to act as if nothing is ever his fault, Hera's list is her anchor to her own reality. It validates her experiences, catalogs her unheard pleas, and serves as a silent, enduring testament to the divine neglect she so patiently, and sometimes not so patiently, endures. The scroll, you sense, will never truly be finished, for as long as Zeus is Zeus, there will always be new entries, new sighs, new mundane disputes to add to the ever-rustling, ever-lengthening record of their Olympian life together. And so, my friend, as the Queen of Olympus perhaps carefully rolls up her immense, invisible scroll of grievances, tucking it away in the quietest, most steadfast corner of her long memory, a sense of profound weariness, yet also an unyielding dignity, settles around her. The endless stream of minor, ignored marital issues, each one a tiny drop in an ocean of divine neglect, continues its flow, as eternal and unchanging as the stars Zeus himself placed in the heavens. But even for a goddess, there comes a time when the cataloging must pause, when the weight of remembered slights can be, if only for a few precious nocturnal hours, set gently aside. The echoes of Zeus's latest pronouncements, whether thunderous snores or flimsy excuses, begin to soften now, to recede into the deep, velvety quiet of the Olympian night. The feasting halls are still. The problematic guests have long since departed or fallen into their own nectar-induced slumbers, and even the ever-watchful eagle, unnoticed, has tucked its head beneath its mighty wing. Imagine Hera, in her own regal chambers, the moonlight casting long, peaceful shadows. Perhaps she gazes out at the silent, wheeling cosmos, a universe of breathtaking beauty and order that stands in such stark contrast to the often petty, frequently frustrating little dramas of her immortal existence. Let the thought of those mundane divine disputes, those endless, sleepy squabbles, now begin to loosen their hold on your own mind, just as Hera must find her moments of respite, her islands of calm in the turbulent sea of her marriage. So too, can you allow your own concerns, both large and small, to drift away on the gentle tide of approaching sleep? Feel the weight of the day, any lingering frustrations or unfinished thought, gently lift from your shoulders, as if carried away by the softest of Olympian breezes, the ones that carry no gossip, no complaints, only the scent of distant, starlit meadows. The grand, intricate tapestry of Greek myth, with all its sound and fury, its comedies and its tragedies, can be set aside for foy. Now, all that matters is the soft hum of the universe, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, inviting you into a space of quiet, untroubled rest. Let the silence of Olympus, at its most peaceful, envelop you, a comforting blanket woven from shadows and starlight, as you drift and drift and drift ever deeper into sweet, restorative slumber.